It is the first time in a long time that we've seen him address some kind of post-war vision. So the idea that perhaps this is the last bastion for Hamas and this is the last military maneuver we might see before most of Gaza, 90%, 100%, might fall over the coming months. It does kind of signal some kind of end, or at least the beginning of the end.
Gabrielle Weiniger, thank you so much for speaking to us. Just talk us through this plan from the Israeli Security Cabinet. What areas is Israel looking to occupy, and how is that different to what they've been doing so far?
It's a new area in the sense that Israel hasn't entered into the 4 main refugee camps in central Gaza and northern Gaza of Gaza City, which are basically expanded refugee camps that became towns. Israel has conducted limited raids in those areas over the last 2 years. They've gone in and then they've gone out saying they've defeated Hamas, and then they've gone in again. It's also been under severe bombardment over the last 2 years. It's not flattened, but it's very destroyed. So it's not new in terms of, it's not a fresh area where nobody's been before. Israel has been in there. Israel has attacked it from the air. What is new is this time they're going to go in and they're going to hold it. And that's what we've been seeing since the breakdown of the ceasefire in March. Israel's going into areas and they are occupying them and they are holding them. And that's what we've seen from troop movement over the past 6 months. They've been quite static. They've gone into areas and they're holding them to prevent what they've had to do. This kind of whack-a-mole game that they were doing before the previous ceasefire, where they go in and go out. Now they're holding territory. So this new plan is to hold this new territory in Gaza City, where some 1 million Palestinians currently live. Those are Palestinians who fled, many of them fled south, the majority of them fled south over the last year of fighting, and then went back to their homes or mostly set up tents in these areas because their homes don't stand anymore, and went back to living in Gaza City, which is kind of the Gaza's main city. It's a very urban area. There's quite narrow streets. What's left of the streets, it's the oldest part of Gaza. And it's really the heart of Gaza. So to see Israeli troops go in there and hold it is new. And it will, Hamas are taking it very seriously. And I think it might be a maneuver also to pressure Hamas to capitulate and to agree perhaps to a previously raised proposal for a ceasefire deal that was offered by Steve Witkoff, the US Middle East envoy.
How difficult is it for the IDF to occupy and hold parts of Gaza as opposed to just these in-out raids?
Currently, it's been successful for them. We haven't seen Hamas return to certain areas. Particularly, we could look at Rafah as an example, which is under full Israeli occupation from the Egyptian border up to Khan Yunis and other areas where there are so-called civilian-only zones where Israel's distributing or overseeing the distribution of aid. So in terms of military success, this is a strategy that works. But we have to look at the reality on the ground for Israeli troops. They are dependent on the call-up of thousands of reservists who are exhausted. They're fatigued from 2 years of war. These are ordinary people who have normal lives. They have families. They have work obligations. Many of them have served around a year in military duty. This is the longest war that Israel's ever fought. So to call up these people is going to take time. It's going to take weeks. The gathering of munitions that they need, we've heard from officials they don't have everything that they need in order to attack this last Hamas stronghold, and also to try and do it somewhat safely. They're going to, of course, mass evacuate the civilians, which is very dangerous for the civilian population, but they also need to protect the hostages that are thought to be held underground by the last leaders of Hamas, who are still in Gaza City. So it's a very delicate operation that is going to take time to plan and strategize. And the timeline we've seen is for all of this to happen up until October the 8th, when the evacuations will have taken place and Israeli troops will be able to go in on the ground.
This is going against the advice of Israeli military commanders, though, isn't it?
It is. We heard IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir warning against the full occupation of Gaza and warning that this will endanger the hostages. And much of the Israeli public agrees with him. That being said, we have never seen a situation where the IDF fails to or refuses to follow orders of the state. And it would be an unprecedented rift between the army and state, which have always been in lockstep together. The army is a pillar of the Jewish state. And to see that happen would be unusual. Also, to see Eyal Zamir step aside because he doesn't agree with the government plans would also be highly unusual, particularly because he was only appointed to his position months ago after the former IDF chief Herzia Levy stepped down over the failures of October the 7th. I don't think Eyal Zamir wants that, rather that prestige or the lack of prestige of stepping down, being the shortest serving army chief of staff. He's going to look to try and find some sort of middle ground, let's call it like that. And in a way, Netanyahu is offering him that because this isn't a full occupation of Gaza City. This is a staged occupation. We're going to see all of that, as we said, over the next 2 months. And there are exit ramps. There's exit ramp to the ceasefire negotiations. There's an exit ramp of not occupying all of Gaza City, particularly the 10% that houses those refugee camps, which are heavily populated and quite difficult to maneuver around. So we might see 90% of Gaza go under. There are a few options on the table where there could be some kind of compromise between Netanyahu and the army chief.
You mentioned the hostages. Will this help them, particularly the ones who are still alive?
Israel has said military pressure helps release the hostages in the way that it puts pressure on Hamas to weaken their position in negotiations. Over the past 2 years, that's not what we've been seeing. We haven't seen that military pressure has pushed Hamas one way or the other, and they haven't given up the hostages. The last hostage that was released was Eden Alexander, the Israeli-American hostage that was released because of direct negotiations between Hamas and America. That was nothing to do with Israeli military pressure. And the families of the hostages say as such. They say this endangers the hostages, it endangers their lives. And they recall that around this time, just a year ago, there were 6 living hostages held in southern Gaza by Hamas gunmen. And when the IDF encroached or approached onto their area and the Hamas militants felt that the IDF was getting near, they shot them dead. And the IDF went in and found 6 dead Israeli hostages, young people, including Karmel Gat, a yoga teacher, who was kind of a symbol of the hostages for many people in Tel Aviv and the liberal communities. They became eulogized in Israeli culture as the beautiful 6. And that's really held very dearly in Israel's heart and in the Israeli public's minds. They're not forgetting what happened to those hostages. They're not forgetting the hostages that were shot dead in and among Hamas militants when there was a raid, over a year ago. There have been incidents which we've seen the hostages are in danger by military pressure, and that's what the families are saying, and that's what much of the Israeli public feels as well.
We've had warnings from people critical of this plan. The UK Prime Minister, for example, saying it'll cause more bloodshed. Will it?
There's been untold bloodshed for Gazan civilians. There's been untold pain and heartbreak for the families of the hostages held there. There's been, the trauma and the horrors of October the 7th. The bloodshed is already so widespread and the societies are so torn apart that, yes, there could well be more of that. And I think that is horrific for the public, the Israeli public and the Gazan public to think about, and the international community as well. Israel are saying this kind of pressure and these kind of comments from the UK, and in particular this grandstanding that Israel says the UK, Canada and France have been doing in the offering to recognize a Palestinian state, has actually pushed the idea of negotiations even further away, because it's given support to Hamas and toughened their stance in negotiations. So I think Israel feels that the international community going against them does not help their cause, and they feel kind of backed into a corner where they keep going on these military strategies, saying this is the last time, this is the last resistance of Hamas, this is the last area we need to go in before the complete defeat of Hamas. And we've seen that statement time and time again, and the war just goes on and on and on, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu keeps his coalition together despite the public's wishes, and more bloodshed and horrors are seen along the way.
And despite that, I mean, what are the international ramifications? I mean, there is a risk, surely, that this further isolates Israel and accelerates some countries who so far are still supportive or not recognising a Palestinian state. It'll accelerate their move away from supporting Netanyahu.
Well, what's on the table right now is those countries, in particular the UK, saying we will recognise a Palestinian state if a ceasefire doesn't happen. And as we mentioned before, there is still a window for a ceasefire. It's been buried in a shallow grave, if you like. There is still room for that. This operation is going to take time to enact. It was only voted on last night. It was a dramatic vote. Hamas are taking it seriously. Israel is taking it seriously. I'm not saying it's not going to happen. That is the plan. But there is still a window of opportunity for the ceasefire to happen. And Israel has signed off on this staged release of their hostages and a 60-day truce, this Witkoff proposal. There is still time for that. Of course, we've had hopes dashed since the breakdown and since the resumption of fighting in March, and it's now August, and there's been very little progress. We've kind of said, oh, we're inching towards a deal, and it's been very close, and there have been moments where I thought it might happen tomorrow, and it didn't, it fell through. But perhaps this is the last piece of the puzzle where Hamas, and in particular the leaders that are currently holed up in Gaza, they don't want to see, and actually the leaders in exile abroad in Doha as well, they don't want to see Gaza fall to Israeli hands, and they might feel that now is the time, at least for a stage release and a ceasefire.
Netanyahu and his security cabinet have laid out conditions to end the war alongside this plan. Just talk us through what they are and how achievable they are, I suppose.
So when we saw the statement saying that this plan had been approved by the security cabinet by a, quote, decisive majority, Netanyahu outlined 5 principles for the new war strategy. The first one was the complete disarmament of Hamas. The second was the return of living and deceased hostages, of which there are 50. 20 are still believed to be alive. It's a demilitarization of the Strip and complete Israeli security control of the Gaza Strip. Now, that's a phrase that can be interpreted in many ways. And the final thing would be the establishment of an alternative civil administration. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu has ruled out Hamas, of course, from ruling the civil administration of Gaza, but also ruled out the Palestinian Authority, which is what the international community says is the most logical leaders of Gaza. But of course, Benjamin Netanyahu's government for many, many decades has tried to separate Hamas, which is the Islamist leaders of the Palestinian resistance, and the Palestinian Authority, which is a more secular community, more secular leadership. They've tried to separate the West Bank and Gaza. That's been a huge, huge policy for Israel to divide and conquer, and they're not likely to agree to see the Palestinian Authority take over such a large swathe of Palestinian territories and, in fact, enable the recognition of a Palestinian state, which many members of his cabinet and Benjamin Netanyahu himself have said they will not preside to see that day when a Palestinian state exists alongside Israel. So he didn't really offer a third option for who was going to take over Gaza, but it is the first time in a long time that we've seen him address some kind of post-war vision. So the idea that perhaps this is the last bastion for Hamas, and this is the last military maneuver we might see before most of Gaza, 90%, 100%, might fall over the coming months. It does kind of signal some kind of end, or at least the beginning of the end.
And he suggested that he wants to hand control of the Strip over to Arab authorities. He hasn't been specific as to who that is. Do we have any sense of who that might be, what that might be?
It's difficult to say. He hasn't been specific about it for a reason. There was a proposal floated by Egypt that Egyptian and Jordanian forces would train Palestinian groups on the ground to take over. We've also seen Israel arm gangs and non-Hamas actors in Rafah, for example, in an effort to bolster, clans and tribes outside of Hamas in Gaza. He wasn't clear if that's what he meant, and I think there are alternatives. They're just not very clear about what's on the table, and he's not clear for a reason.
Is there a time limit to this plan at all? If Israel were to occupy Gaza City, or is it open-ended?
No, they have put a deadline on, or not a deadline, rather a blueprint for how long this will take, and they've said it will take up to 2 months to enact the plan. So October the 7th, which is the 2-year anniversary of the massacre of 1,200 Israeli civilians and soldiers, and the kidnapping of over 250 in this dreadful day. So there is a time frame. But we've seen before that the war has been dragging on, and it's an all-encompassing war, encompassing absolutely every factor or part of everyday life for Israelis and for Gazans, particularly for Gazans who are under heavy bombardment every day, but also for the Israelis who are suffering economic and social and mental consequences. For example, we were reading this week that the suicide rate for Israeli soldiers has gone up dramatically. There's a lot of PTSD in that society. It's a society that cannot fully heal until this war is over and the hostages have been returned. Gaza cannot be rebuilt until the war ends and some kind of civil administration takes over and reigns over the chaos and hunger that is currently presiding there. So to put a time frame on that, yes, there's a military strategy and there's a military time frame and there's a military blueprint for how that might happen. But in reality, as it goes down, the people are the ones that are so badly affected by this.
And just finally, Gabrielle, supporters of Netanyahu would say this is the only way to defeat Hamas, to return hostages. Critics suggest, his most staunch critics suggest, that occupying Gaza is the end game, and it's about denying territory towards a Palestinian state. You've spoken here about, is it a tool to put pressure on Hamas for negotiations? Is it just about keeping the show on the road in terms of his coalition? What do you think Netanyahu's end game is with this plan?
His end game is always to stay in power. He had a window now to not worry so much about his coalition falling or imploding, because there's a break right now in the Israeli parliament where it's unlikely to for anyone to step down, in this time, where he could have gone for a ceasefire and the government would have stayed standing until the parliament resumes in September or even October after the Jewish holidays. But there is critics, you're right, that say that this plan bows to these fringe elements of his government who call for a messianic vision for Gaza. They call for the resettlement of Jewish civilians inside Gaza. And I think many soldiers don't wish to fight for that vision. They wish to fight for the hostages to be freed, for the war to end, and to live safely and to never ever see something like October the 7th happen to their society ever again. I think those are the demands of the Israeli people, not to reoccupy Gaza. But there is, this voice inside the government has taken over, and Netanyahu does listen to it, and he does try to appease that side of his government.
Gabrielle Weiniger, thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thanks for having me.